Hello, friends. If you are watching this on the release week, Resurrection Sunday was this last Sunday, which means in this teaching, we need to whoop it up because the resurrection is the most epic moment of celebration in the entire year. Everything is centered around this. And so I want to help you to see how John tells the story of the resurrection in his gospel, his biography on the life of Jesus. And so notice with me, John chapter 20 starts off this way, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And then from there, she leaves and she goes and tells Peter and John. They run to the tomb. They don't get what's going on. They leave. Mary goes back. She has a conversation with these two angels. And then all of a sudden, Jesus appears. And it says this in verse 14. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener. And then he'll reveal himself to her and all of that. What I'm interested in is the detail that John includes, that Mary mistakes Jesus for a gardener. Why, if you have limited room to write, do you include such a detail? And what's more, if you're Jesus and you've just been conquered the grave, you just conquered it all, do you really want to be mistaken for a gardener? What is John doing here? Well, actually, a couple chapters earlier, John has introduced a theme that he's carried through chapter 18, 19, and again here in chapter 20. It's the idea of the garden. And he talks about garden, and then all of a sudden, Jesus is mistaken for a gardener, and you go, okay, John has been doing something here, and every good first century Jewish listener, when they heard the word garden, they would immediately run to the most significant moment in the scriptures that dealt with a garden, and it's, you got it, Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. In Genesis 1, God is creating a good world. It is good, it is good, it is good. And then in Genesis 2, you have a more focused account of God creating humanity, and he creates Adam and he brings him into the garden, and then God says, Adam, we need to talk about a tree. Now, just real quick, the Bible never says it's an apple tree. All right, I'm not sure where we got that from. I personally think it's a pomegranate tree because pomegranate is the biblical fruit of wisdom. But be that as it may, we're not told. It is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God says to Adam, Adam, there's a tree in the garden, and it's the knowledge of good and evil, and if you eat of it, you will surely die, which was God's way of introducing the idea to Adam that sin and death are linked. And God says to Adam, Adam, I need you to obey me about this tree in the garden. And we all know that Adam doesn't obey God about the tree in the midst of the garden. And sin and pain and brokenness and chaos and death, everything that is not supposed to be part of God's original good story and creation enters in to the storyline, and everything breaks and is fractured. And in Genesis 3, God's talking to Adam and Eve about the ramifications of what they've done, but then God addresses the serpent. And God says this, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. God says, one is coming along. You will strike his heel, but he's going to crush your head. And then the rest of the story plays out. God comes to Abram, I'm going to partner with you and your descendants. We're going to put the world together. And Abram's descendants, they just take the story and bury it into the ground, and they experience exile, and it's ugly, and they just completely mess up. And then you have the New Testament opens up, which is just a continuation of the Older Testament, and you have 4 accounts on the life of Jesus, 4 gospels, we call them, these biographies, and each of the gospel writers is setting out to tell how Jesus is the fulfillment of the entire storyline that has come before. And since we're dealing with John, let me show you how John is organizing his account, because it's absolutely astounding. And we call this the signs in John. And here's what I mean by that. In John chapter 2, John gives the first miracle of Jesus. And in verse 11, he says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So you have this sign of Jesus turning water into wine, chapter 2, and it culminates with John saying this is the first of the signs. And you go, well, that's odd. None of the other gospel writers talk about Jesus' miracles as being signs. What is John up to? And then you come to John chapter 4, and you have the second of the signs with the healing of the royal official's son, because in verse 54 we read, this was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. So John is tipping his audience off to the fact that he's doing something, and in good Jewish fashion, John has been living out with this sign stuff, a passage all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15, which reads this: one witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. Now you go, this is dealing with a crime. What does this have anything to do with the signs in John? Well, when you start moving through the rest of the Bible, this idea of 2 or 3 witnesses or 2 or 3 examples to confirm something becomes the norm. I mean, in fact, you have this all over the Gospels, and 3 times in the New Testament, you have the second half of this verse being quoted verbatim, that someone on 2 or 3 witnesses or 2 or 3 examples will confirm what they are doing. So in good Jewish fashion, twice now, John has used the word signs, and he's telling his audience, start counting, because he's not going to use the word signs again. He's already tipped his audience off to what they should be doing. So as a good reader of John's gospel, we go, okay, well, we've got these 2 signs. What happens next? Well, the third sign is the healing of the paralytic in chapter 5. The fourth sign is the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6. The next miracle Jesus does is he walks on water. So this is the 5th sign, and this is also in John chapter 6. The 6th sign is the healing of the blind man, chapter 9. And then the 7th sign, we have the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. And then we don't get anything else until John chapter 20, when Jesus rises from the dead. He does so as the 8th sign of John. Now, if you're like me, you're going, okay, what's up with the 8th thing? Why has John done this? What is the point that he's trying to make? We'll get there in a moment. A quick distinction, and an important one, between what happens to Lazarus in chapter 11 and Jesus in chapter 20, because it's not the same thing, even though oftentimes people use the same language. People will look at what Jesus did with Lazarus, as well as Jairus' daughter and the widow's son in Nain, as a resurrection. But what Jesus did in raising these folks back to life, this was not a resurrection, this was a resuscitation. And here's the distinction. A resurrection means that you are dead, but you come back to life, never to die again. Jairus' daughter, the widow's sons from Nain, and Lazarus, they all brought back from the dead. They were dead, but they all died again. Which would stink, right? Having to die twice. But I'm assuming you're blessing God for the time that you had back with friends and family. So what Lazarus goes through and what Jesus goes through is not the same thing, because when Jesus dies, he comes back to life never to die again. And this is what's astounding about the resurrection, because for many of the Jewish people, their theology is that there is a great resurrection at the end of the story, but Jesus is resurrected in the midst of the story, and Jesus is the only person in human history who has been resurrected from the dead. Now, Jesus rises from the dead. He is resurrected from the dead as the 8th sign of John. Now, you start looking in the Hebrew scriptures and you go, so what's up with 8? And you find the example that when a young Jewish baby boy is circumcised, they are circumcised on the 8th day. And the reason for that is circumcision is the sign of God's covenant with his people given to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 17. And the idea is that when a baby boy is birthed into the world, those first 7 days are them identifying with the 7 days of creation, which were shattered because of the sin that was brought into the storyline. And then on the 8th day, it's the first day of a new week, of a new reality, because you are a new creation, because you've come into covenant relationship with God. And that is precisely what John is telling us about the resurrection as the 8th sign, is that it is the 8th sign, or it's the 8th day, or you could say it's the first day of a new week, of a new reality, because Jesus is a new creation that is bursting forth in the midst of the old world. And those first 7 signs connect to those first 7 days, which are climaxed with the raising of Lazarus, which foreshadows the resurrection of Jesus, so that when Jesus rises on the first day of the week, we have as the first verse in John chapter 20, he does so as the 8th sign, the 8th day, the first day of a new reality bursting forth. And the reason that Jesus is able to rise from the dead is because he went to a cross. And that whole thing started in John chapter 18. And this is where this whole garden thing just starts to take off. So hang with me for a few more moments and we'll pull the pieces together. In John chapter 18, Jesus is arrested. Now, if you just stand on the Temple Mount, and I was just on Temple Mountain in Jerusalem just a few days ago, and by the time you're watching this, it'll be more than maybe a week or two, is that you can look across from the Temple Mount, across the Kidron Valley, and you see the Church of All Nations. And the Church of All Nations commemorates where Jesus went to pray and where he was arrested. Now, what's interesting is that the other gospel writers talk about this area as being Gethsemane. John doesn't use the word Gethsemane. In fact, the words Garden of Gethsemane are never linked in the gospel stories. John talks about it as being a garden. The other gospel writers talk about it as being Gethsemane. Now, what is a Gethsemane? Gethsemane is over here, and Gethsemane is a fusion of 2 Hebrew words, gat, which means the place of pressing, which can refer to a wine press, but when it's connected to the word shemanim, or shemanim is the word oils, is now a Gethsemane is a place of the pressing of oils. It's where you would have olives would be crushed and then made into olive oil. And so that's what a Gethsemane is, and there is a 1st century Gethsemane in this location of where the garden was, where the Church of All Nations was. Here's a picture of this that you can go down into, and this commemorates the area where the olive press was. But this is a term of agony. That's why the other gospel writers are including the word Gethsemane, because it's more than just a place. It's what it symbolizes. Jesus is feeling the weight of the world pressing in upon him. Luke even goes so far as to say that Jesus is dripping sweat and blood together because he feels so pressed and so crushed by the sin of the world. John doesn't use the word Gethsemane. He uses the word garden. And so this is a garden area, and he's using this language because what he doesn't want to highlight is any agony that Jesus felt. And so he doesn't use the word Gethsemane, which is a term of agony. He doesn't include in his gospel how 3 times Jesus prayed that he didn't have to go to the cross, because that was agonizing for Jesus. And what's more, John does not include that Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek to betray him, to turn him over, because as Jesus' disciple, this was like one of Jesus' boys. This was agonizing for Jesus, but for John, no agony. He doesn't want us to even have the picture of agony in connection to a garden. And you go, so what is John after? Well, that's where we get John chapter 19, which we're told about right before the resurrection. And for us, this is where the pieces come together. Because listen to how John talks about what happens after Jesus' death. This is in verse 41 of John chapter 19. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Now, if you go to this area today, this is where you will find the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the entrance in, and this commemorates the traditional location of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And you come here and you're in the midst of the city today, and it's like, what is going on? It's hard to get your bearings. But this is where a really great artist rendering done by Leon Rittenmeyer is really helpful, because John tells us that the site of the crucifixion and the tomb are in the midst of a garden. And for John, any cultivated area constitutes a garden. When we think garden, we think all these different colors of flowers and all that. Listen, if there are olive trees around, this is a garden for John. And he says, in the garden, there is the cross. And in the garden, there is a tomb. And so what we learn from John is that when Jesus goes to the cross, it's in the midst of a garden area. And so just as God said to Adam, Adam, I need you to obey me with respect to this tree in the midst of the garden, Adam failed to do so. God says to Jesus, I need you to obey me about this tree in the midst of the garden, and Jesus does it. And when Jesus dies on the cross, he dies on the cross for the sins of the world. But it can't just end with a cross. You need the empty tomb as well. Because all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, God said to Adam, when you eat of this tree, you will surely die. Sin and death are linked. And for many of us, we focus on a cross. We go to our church and there's a cross on stage, but there's no empty tomb. But friends, without the empty tomb, this doesn't mean anything. Because Jesus on Friday died for the sins of the world on the cross. But on Sunday, he rose from the grave, validating his sacrifice by conquering death, because sin and death, they are linked. And Jesus effectively took care of them both. And he did so in the midst of a garden. And so on the cross, Satan struck Jesus' heel, but with the empty tomb, Jesus crushed his head. And he did so in the midst of a garden, and then he rises from the dead, and he is mistaken for a gardener. Of course he's mistaken for a gardener, because the gardener has done his work. He has dealt with both sin and death in the midst of a garden in order to reclaim what was lost when sin and death entered in the first garden. And what John wants you to see is that for Jesus, there is no agony before he is being arrested, that there is no agony with respect to the garden, because when Jesus is in the garden, there is victory. And friends, that's how John tells his epic tale, as the eighth sign that Jesus is a new creation bursting forth in the midst of the old world. A new reality has burst forth because he has died and risen again in the midst of a garden, dealing with sin and death and giving you and me hope for today and for the future, because he is the culmination of the entire story. And on the cross and in the empty tomb, you have the climactic moment in human history, that all will be well at the end of the story, that sin and death do not get the final word, because Jesus conquered both in the midst of a garden. And friends, that's the hope we celebrate on this week of the resurrection. And this is the hope we get to celebrate each and every day, because the tomb is empty. The gardener has done his work. And I believe that we should all say together, amen. Friends, that's the beauty of the resurrection. Hey, thanks so much for stopping in and watching this teaching. You can head over to walkingthetext.com. You can leave comments. There are discussion questions. If you know someone who just needs to hear this teaching, please feel free to pass this along, to share this with them. Again, thanks for watching, and may the power of the resurrection be available to you as you continue to walk out the text faithfully in your life.